in a few seconds. Gonna get it. 3, 2, 1. Hello, welcome everyone who's watching us at the moment from their screens. Thank you for joining our live stream for our discussion today on hydrogen from overseas, energy systems and neo-colonial power dynamics. So $20 billion to export green hydrogen. Namibia's plans on green hydrogen are big. They're actually bigger than the country's GDP, which was around $12 billion in 2022. And this development is actually mirroring a global trend around hydrogen. It is rapidly gaining global attention as a key resource for our energy transition. There are governments, there are institutions, there are corporations who are heavily investing in its development, particularly in the expansion of green hydrogen. And on the African continent, Namibia and Morocco emerge as key sites for these kinds of development. But who might benefit from mega projects like the $20 billion green hydrogen project in Namibia under the direction of Hyphen? And who might be left behind and harmed? So today we want to discuss these questions under the title of Hydrogen from Overseas, Energy Systems and Neo-Colonial Power Dynamics. We have amazing guests with us. Some are here with me, some are joining us online from different locations. And yeah, we're going to have a discussion, and there's also be an opportunity at the end of this event to pose your questions, so keep them in mind, please. Also, this year marks 130 years since the Berlin Conference, where African borders were violently drawn by colonial powers, and it's also 120 years since the Ovaherero Nama genocide committed under the German colonial administration. With this in mind, we are discussing hydrogen developments or developments in the energy and just transition sector in the context of Africa's colonial past and also present, while examining Namibia's green hydrogen initiatives alongside the long-standing issue of energy colonialism in Western Sahara. My name is Fatim Selina Diaby, and I'm honored to moderate today's session. Also, a short funders note: this event is funded by Aktionsgemeinschaft Global with the support of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I would like to start our discussion today by introducing you to our three interesting guests who are joining us today. I'm going to start with the one who's sitting right next to me, Emma Levib, who's a spokesperson of the Sahrawi diaspora in Germany. And Emma is dedicated to advocate for the right to self-determination for the people of Western Sahara. And she also will shed light on the implications of Morocco's hydrogen projects on the occupied Western Sahara. Then we also have online joining us, Tony Boykes. Tony Boykes is the head of ECG for Hyphen, Environmental Social Governance. She's looking after how Namibians would directly benefit from the project through the implementation of a broad socio-economic development framework that seeks to prioritize Namibian participation on the project through employment and local procurement. And lastly, we also have with us Dr. Franziska Müller. She leads a research project on hydrogen at the University of Hamburg, and her work mostly focused on socio-ecological and political risks associated with hydrogen production, particularly in the so-called Global South. Regarding the structure for today, we roughly have 75 minutes for our discussion part, and then later a few more minutes for our question part. And our discussion today is separated in different segments. We're going to first cover the basics. So what is actually hydrogen? What is green hydrogen? And we will provide an overview of hydrogen technology. Then we're going to move towards the impacts. So we're going to discuss the environmental and social risks of hydrogen, the social impacts, possible human rights violations, and economic challenges. Lastly, we're going to look at intersections. How does hydrogen intersect intersect with injustice, but maybe also justice and energy colonialism. As said, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so please have your question in mind, write them down, and later you can share them with us and the panelists. Okay, so as already said, we're going to start with the basics, and I would like to first ask Dr. Franziska Müller to maybe give us an overview about hydrogen. What is hydrogen? What does it mean to produce hydrogen? And maybe also what are the potential benefits but also risks integrating hydrogen into the energy mix?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and hello from my side. That's of course a large question, and I'm just trying to squeeze it all into a brief answer. And it's clear that the race for hydrogen production has just started, but before we talk about economic and socio-ecological aspects, maybe let me briefly come up with some definitions, because there's a whole color scheme of hydrogen, and sometimes the people are mixing it and are wondering, wow, what kind of rainbow is that actually? So there's turquoise hydrogen, which is created by a thermal process where natural gas is broken down with the help of methane into hydrogen and solid carbon. So that's one way. And then one color that is very often debated is blue hydrogen, which is created from the steam reduction of natural gas. And during that process, the natural gas is split into hydrogen and CO2. And then the carbon dioxide can either be emitted into the atmosphere, but what we want with the blue hydrogen is that this the carbon dioxide is stored or processed industrially. So carbon capture and storage technology would then be one of the ways to store the carbon dioxide underground. To technically label it as carbon neutral, because the carbon dioxide is somehow stored, but could of course become a burden for future generations. And then there's also gray hydrogen, which means it is not climate neutral, and is also used by reforming fossil fuels such as natural gas or coal. But I guess for today's evening, we are mostly going to concentrate on green hydrogen, because this is actually where most of the political action goes into. Green hydrogen, of course, looks very nice at first, but it carries many ambivalencies, which is actually why we're actually here, because the way that green hydrogen is rapidly expanding may reinvoke dangers of green extractivism or energy colonialism. And when you talk about green hydrogen, we mean that the hydrogen is produced on a carbon neutral basis through the electrolysis of water, and that means that we need large quantities of water, which is then split into its elements of oxygen and hydrogen, and the electricity that is needed to make that kind of split into the oxygen and the hydrogen is all generated from renewable energies, which means wind energy, hydropower, or solar energy. So that's how the carbon neutrality is created. And the hydrogen production market is expected to grow quite a lot till about 10% annually till 2030. So, and green hydrogen is going to play a really major role in that regard. If I have still time, I'd like to share some slides that would give us a bigger picture on how the world economy and also North-South relations come into.
Yeah, that would be perfect. The next question.
I need the rights.
Okay. The next question I would have for you would go in the direction of how the hydrogen industry developed, and specifically asking why most large-scale green hydrogen projects, also like the one in Namibia, focus on export to European partner countries. But I guess you're also going to cover this in your presentation.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, but I still need the rights for screen sharing.
Okay, I'm not so sure. I'm looking at our technicians. I think you should have the rights now.
No, I don't have the rights. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I should become co-host, and I guess then it's all going to work fine.
Okay, so we're just going to figure this out. Maybe another question in between. What made you, because your research mostly focused on hydrogen, now you're a co-host. What is your your motivation as a researcher to do such extensive research on this energy source?
Well, I became just curious in the issue at some point, and for me, questions of energy justice are very important, and that's why I thought, okay, we need to see to what extent justice questions are also at issue in that regard. So I now have the rights. Just maybe quickly to bring us on the same page. Why is there actually such a large rush? One reason is that carbon neutrality has become such a major issue, but when big industrial powers want to decarbonize their energy sectors, they need some kind of technology that also makes it hard to abate sectors carbon neutral, and this means the steel industry, the automotive industry, for development cooperation, all promoting a rapid expansion, sometimes even at odds with each others. And Germany's role as a major future hydrogen importer relies very much on a kind of import strategy. And I mean, for Germany, the main dilemma is, on the one hand, to keep the model Deutschland, Germany as the big industrial power in the world, but at the same time also be an equally important force in terms of decarbonizing the industry sector. And this is where hydrogen comes in. And this also means that we see new geopolitical constellations forming. There's also a diplomatic goal to integrate African countries, the MENA region or Eastern Europe, into the great hydrogen game. And it makes, from a geophysical perspective, it makes much sense to look at the import-export regions which have the highest geophysical potential, and these are all situated in the global south, either where we have huge solar radiation or where we have ideal factors for the wind industry. And that's why the Maghreb region, the MENA region, Southern Africa or Chile or also Australia, of course, come in. And so Germany has an important national hydrogen strategy, which was at first only focusing on green hydrogen, because this was very much in the interest of our governing coalition. But then there was the urge to really ramp up the hydrogen sector very, very rapidly. And this is where the openness for blue and gray hydrogen also entered the debate, because blue and gray hydrogen is much easier and much quicker to get. And the needs are really high, and here we also see that large quantities of the hydrogen need to come in as a kind of import product. At the moment, we're still we are getting step by step towards a hydrogen import strategy, which will mostly focus on countries in the global south. And the question is, of course, also how the costs and also the import costs can somehow be leveled in a good way. So, and when we talk about hydrogen, we very much are centering the potential benefits of hydrogen production, the benefits for the importing countries, the access to low carbon energy carriers, and we're also talking about return on investment through technology transfer and also to job creation in countries of the global south. But, and this is very important for me in my research, we also need to talk about hydrogen justice, about land grabs happening, about water use, energy use, and also we need to talk about background factors for like labor standards, or also about the situation for environmental activists, and also the extent to which people are in fact able to participate in such major changes for a country's economy. And this is why issues like energy colonialism or green extractivism also come in.
Thank you, Dr. Franziska Müller. Thank you for shedding light on this. And we're also going to talk later in our discussion about energy colonialism. And also, I think Tony Boykes from Hyphen will also talk about the vision or the plan that Hyphen has to also include the communities in Namibia. I just wanted to thank you again for highlighting the role Germany is playing in the global expansion of hydrogen, and also highlighting again how the first strategy was around green hydrogen, but was then expanded to blue and gray hydrogen, also keeping in mind that at the moment now less than 0.1% of globally produced hydrogen is using renewable energies. I would move to Liab, and I will give you later the opportunity to also expand more on your research, Dr. Franziska Müller. Emma. So Dr. Franziska Müller already talked about the labeling of hydrogen, often as a green energy source, very much directly linked to renewable energies, and also briefly mentioned at the end the environmental risks, but also the destructions and the repressions that might follow with the industry growing and also fueling the climate crisis, as it might be as clean as it's always proposed. And I would say the people of West Sahara have their fair share and long-standing history in terms of how the expansion of an energy sector of a nation state is threatening their very livelihood. Also keeping in mind that the Moroccan government is trying to position itself as a key actor for green energy in Africa, especially for European partners. So my question for you would be, how do you think the planned hydrogen projects affect the Sahrawi people, particularly regarding their land and their resources, but also their fight for freedom, considering that Western Sahara is the last standing African colony, or the colony in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Also, thank you for the invitation and the organization of this event. So as you mentioned, one of the biggest players in terms of hydrogen, especially on the African continent, is supposed to be Namibia and Morocco. And Morocco published a report, I think in 2023, establishing or describing which locations are the best, or like have the best combination of like photovoltaic and wind power to enable the production of green hydrogen cost efficiently so, and that is actually in Dakhla. And Dakhla is not in Morocco, but in the occupied territories in Western Sahara. So I have probably to go back a bit in history why that is an issue. So Western Sahara used to be a Spanish colony until about 1975, and already there was uprisings by the local communities against the Spanish colonizer. And at the same time, well, first Morocco was supporting the independence movement, but changed and made claims over the territory and decided to invade the country. So in that same year, the International Court of Justice confirmed the right to self-determination of the Sahrawi people and also denied any claims made by Morocco. Anyhow, they invaded via the Green March into Western Sahara and maintained to occupy the territory until now. So in 1991, there was a ceasefire, and they were supposed to set up a referendum, which did not take place 30 years later, and we are now back to a war zone. So Morocco is controlling 2/3 of the territory, illegally so, and why does Western Sahara matter to Morocco? And of course, the logical expansionist idea of the nation state, but also it's just profitable. Like there's resources, fishery, phosphate, oil, sand, agriculture, like so much. And is kind of the you firstly have the wind parks and solar parks, which are already operating. Wind parks set up by Siemens Energy, a German company. And now the new one is hydrogen projects. And there are discussions between Morocco and the European Union and Morocco about hydrogen projects. The most profitable way to do it is in Western Sahara. The production in Dakhla, the city I mentioned earlier, it would cost like $250 per kilogram to produce hydrogen, whilst in the 3 times the amount. So if we're talking about green hydrogen, they might be eyeing Western Sahara. It has never been consented to by our people. And it's a violation of the law, and it legitimizes Morocco as the occupier because any deal is made by Morocco. But I think I can, if you have further questions.
Yeah. Tying everything that is happening in Western Sahara, Germany, and the involvement of German companies back, and also the European Union in that sense. How colonialism might also intersect with the hydrogen industry and its expansion. Now on to Tony Boyd. ask, how do you think renewable energy projects might affect indigenous communities, as this is something you are working and you're working for Hyphen, which is set to implement a $20 billion green hydrogen project in Namibia, which was before, inter alia together with the German. And first, my question for you would be to maybe provide us with a bit of background about the Hyphen project.
To everyone online. So, for the introduction, I'm Tony Beekers, head of ESG for the Hyphen that is based in Namibia. So, is what we refer to as a fully integrated gigawatt scale green hydrogen project. It is the first of the projects under the hydrogen strategy. We look to deliver 2 million in context, that's about half of what Germany currently produces in terms of ammonia. We look to produce that ammonia from about 7 gigawatt of a combination of wind and solar resources, and utilize about 3 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity. We have our project, by the way, is located in south-westerly part of Namibia, so very close to the South African border, and in very close to a small town called Ludritz and another town called Aas, respectively. The agreement we've concluded is a feasibility and implementation agreement in the way that it has been structured. It is potentially a 40-year concession agreement, where we've been allowed to enter the land on a concessionary basis for a 40-year period under a lease agreement with the Namibian government to first of all explore the feasibility of this project. Because after 2.5 years of exploring feasibility, we go through a validation phase. The Namibian government can then determine, based on various criteria, whether or not this project is feasible for implementation. That is understanding whether or not we have environmental clearance on the project, whether we have envisioned what I will touch on and go into a little bit more detail later, a socio-economic development framework so that we can get other things. This is a $10 billion project, roughly, as you've said. We need to raise significant debt on in the open market, and so we need to demonstrate the availability of debt and, of course, the equity component. Very, very important to note that Hyphen is not a German project. Hyphen has one German shareholder, which is Enertrac, and they are a developer of green of renewable energy. But very, very important to understand that the character of Hyphen, and I speak as a Namibian, Hyphen is a Namibian project. We have 24% equity by the Namibian government, and then we have equity in the project by Enertrac, which is a German shareholder, and which is a large infrastructure development. So very important to understand that any country within the EU already project of strategic interest, and we can speak to the reasons why that is so for Germany. But also we have MOU potential offtake companies in Namibian, and so it breaks my heart when we talk about the plight of the Sahara and what's there. There is a misconception, however, green hydrogen production experience. And so whereas let me ask can enable the growth not internationally government strategy large-scale green hydrogen. Government strategy large-scale green hydrogen. It continuously has embarked on projects stream opportunity for Namibia. And we can map more to map more to augment what it's doing in terms of green hydrogen exportation.
Economic development and how
under the project from the outset. There are, of course, the framework that is employment, but skills development component to feasibility phase in order to take up. Similarly, we have added an procurement or local content. Our target at this stage is 30% local content. Namibian context of a 10 billion is about 60 billion. The biggest investment would see in opportunities. We have a very small industrial base, capacity building to strengthen capacity in the Namibia development program. We will identify a value chain that can be localized further to enhance, optimize the corporate social element, localize the corporate social where the project will be. Is towns of literates and are relative 30,000 people. Hyphen will be out of public and social developer. One of the is how do we collaborate with government and be able to deliver that. So that's the seventh element that frames the negotiations. Set ourselves targets. We're now going to studies we've employed to deliver and give us to ground the 15,000 to 3,000 are actually the real numbers in the current program. And our 90% Namibian employment localized, are those feasible? And once we have read those commitments to government, and once those commitments have been made, they will be hardwired in the contract. So have included evaluations in the framework so that Hyphen is held accountable to the commitments that's made for each of those elements. And this framework is incredibly important as the first gigawatts. This role very serious because we are really a catalyst for how the Namibian government would roll out its green hydrogen strategy, and we hope that for this framework to be really the standard, how it'll be.
Is also located in a national park, in the Tsaukaab National Park. I would also ask you about the environmental risks and the impacts that might come with the project, also having in mind that there are different positions within the Namibian society. For example, the Namibian Chamber of Environment published a position paper in May 2024 talking about red hydrogen. I quote, "The extensive industrial development planned for one of the world's few arid biodiversity hotspots could only produce red hydrogen, as it would threaten the percentage of many endemic plant and animal species, So the color red here is a reference to the red list of endangered animals and plant species that might be threatened with the development of this project. And also having in mind that 70% of Namibia is under nature conservation, and this is more than in any other country in the world. Furthermore, there's also the consultant to Hyphen, Dr. Antje Borke, who specifically said there are no green energy projects that can be implemented without some environmental impact. So the question is now, how are you planning to address the environmental risks and also the impact that comes with this hydrogen development?
Thank you for the question. I think the first thing to note is, and just to correct you on that statistic, Namibia has about 42% of its land mass under one or other form of environmental protection. Namibia is also one of the only countries in the world that has environmental protection enshrined in its constitution. That should tell you something about Namibia. We take biodiversity and protection of the environment perhaps more seriously than any other country in the world, given those statistics, right? So that's the first thing. Namibia has come up with a strategy to develop green hydrogen. And so Hyphen, by extension, but Namibia as a country has an incredible opportunity to be one of the leaders in helping the world define what sustainable environmental and social development looks like for the hydrogen sector. And it's I think from that perspective, given Namibia's history and relationship with environmental protection, I think it's relatively in good hands. So when it comes to how we approach environmental protection under the project, the first thing to note is we have to comply first and foremost with Namibian legislation, like I said, which is pretty stringent. And part of that process involves proper consultation with different stakeholders. That's the first. Number two, this is a mega project, and in order to be able to raise the capital that we need, we have to comply with the highest international standards. At this stage, that is very much, if we look at international benchmarks, IFC performance standards, particularly in this case on biodiversity, that also touches on critical habitat. We're in a unique situation because we do not have because of the time and the scale in terms of which this project is implemented. Typically, you would have a situation where you can do an environmental assessment process, and then you look at the implementation of the project. The beauty of the Hyphen project and what's important to understand in how we're approaching the design is it is an iterative process because the ecology of the environment is constantly informing us, informing our design, right? The Namibian government has now embarked on undertaking a strategic environmental and social impact assessment that will map not just what Hyphen is doing, and we're obviously doing a separate ESIA, but it will map what are the implications and the cumulative impacts potentially of implementing green hydrogen projects in the Southern Corridor Development Initiative, which is that first green hydrogen valley where Hyphen has been allocated land. What we've done as early de-risking on the environmental side, we've taken the land area that we've been allocated. As you said, this is a national park, so there's an existing environmental management plan in place. And we have mapped the area to look at what is the highest, medium, and lowest biodiversity hotspot in terms of that plan. And early thinking is then we have located the infrastructure based on those areas. So typically you would understand that your highest biodiversity is closest to the shore because you have the fog belt coming in, so you have a lot of fauna and flora there. And so whereas even though from a resource perspective your wind would be highest closest to the shore, we've moved that into the medium to lower areas.
Thank you, Tony Boykes.
Similarly,
it's just so that everyone has enough time to speak.
Yeah.
But you're going to have an opportunity to expand a bit more about what you just mentioned. Thank you so far. I would turn to Anna Levy because clearly, as stated out by Tony Boykes, Hyphen is trying to implement a project, a big-scale energy project that aims to also in some ways fostering socio-economic development and combining the advancements of industrial renewable energy project with the advancements of society, so working towards a more just reality and society in that sense. What do you think are lessons learned from West Sahara in that context of big-scale energy projects and also the combination of socio-economic development?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think these projects are inherently colonial because they are happening without the consent of the people who are descendant from there. So these decisions are made above their heads, benefiting the occupiers, the former colonizers. So that structure inherently is already colonial, and then it has real political impact because like there's a bunch of points, but one I would like to mention first is the settler colonial practices by Morocco. So Morocco is in itself a very poor country. There's a high amount of people in poverty, and that also what the Moroccan politics are doing is they're trying to incentivize people to leave Morocco and settle in Western Sahara because they are promised higher paid wages and actual jobs, because it's, of course, due to the growing infrastructure set up there, you have a lot of jobs building up. And Sahrawi people in Western Sahara, those that are still remaining there, are completely discriminated against. They are not able to have any of those jobs unless they dismiss their whole claim on their right to self-determination. So this is enabling settler colonial practices. It is also, there have been reports and talks of Sahrawis who have been expelled from their houses to use that space in order to build these parks, wind parks, solar parks, and maybe later on hydrogen projects. And another thing is it is not encouraging Morocco, rather discouraging Morocco to have serious talks, peace talks, and to enable the right the effective right to self-determination, because Morocco, as of now, is importing 90% of its energy from abroad. So it has a high dependency and it wants to decrease that. And along with becoming a pioneer in renewable energies, they are advocating for these renewable projects and therefore growing dependent on Western Sahara if they're going to import energy coming from there. And another thing is that, for example, I think all wind parks, other than one, are all the deals are made with this company called Nareva, and they're all in the, it's owned by the Moroccan king. So he is financially profiting personally from those projects. So how is he supposed to have talks with the Polisario, which is our sole legal representative, and actually find a real solution? So these implications are grave, and they're also enabling the exploitation of other resources. For example, there's one phosphate company. It is almost completely, its energy is resourced from wind parks. So it's enabling the extraction of other resources. It's disincentivizing the Moroccan government to find real solutions, and it's more complex because you have an interest, more settlers, in making political change more difficult.
Thank you so much for colonial structures, but also development. We talked a bit about self-determination. In that sense, we also briefly touched on a maybe more just or equal society. And I would like to turn to Dr. Franziska Müller again, because you are actually working specifically on the concept of hydrogen justice and energy colonialism. For example, you published an article titled Hydrogen Justice, where you are defining 6 dimensions of hydrogen justice. Could you maybe explain to us what your intention or motivation was to connect hydrogen with justice, and also briefly explain the different dimensions you are working on?
Self-dimension come in, and also historical constellations that it makes sense to expand the concepts of water justice or energy justice and look at it in a more fresh way. As this is a bit abstract, I'm just going to share my screen again so that it's a bit easier to understand. So there we are. Yeah, we're combining 6 different dimensions and we do that in a quite abstract way, so that it's able to have a very broad frame and develop different indicators and very concrete criteria on the lower level. So procedural justice is everything related to decision-making processes and to participation, like is any actor involved? Can actors come up with a free, prior, informed consent? Do they really have the right to say no? I actually have to say that many of our Namibian collaboration partners who identify as frontline communities are often saying, well, we did have the right to say no to that. We were invited to panels, especially not to the shiny ones that were created by our environmental minister, Robert Habeck. Also, distributive justice comes in, asking how the costs and benefits of green hydrogen are distributed, who is benefiting from the green hydrogen, who has to carry a kind of burden in terms of land use, water use, higher energy costs, ecological costs, for instance, by desalination. Restorative justice also comes in, like to what extent may historical injustices be deepened. Stuff like land conflicts is a point, exploitative labor conditions may be a point, or also, as we have now been talking very much about environmental impact assessments, well, there isn't questions like mass graves of the genocide in Namibia, questions of displacement of long-term colonized people are issues that very much touch this restorative justice dimension and cannot be resolved by an environmental impact assessment alone, because this goes to much deeper issues. We also need to talk about the desecration of spiritual sites, an issue that is, for instance, very much captured in the Biodiversity Convention, but is not so often touched upon because it's a very sensitive issue and difficult to talk about. Relational justice also comes in, wondering how human-land relations are changing, like when these arid regions or deserts become now commodified, or when one thinking is of deserts as empty and unused spaces. This is a way of talking. There's a way of talking about the land in a very, capitalist and commodifying sense, and it's also important to create a sense of awareness about how these relations are changing, how people think of the land, and think of land that maybe even consider a kind of sacral site or a very deeply felt historical site. Recognitional justice also comes in, wondering whose interests, needs, and vulnerabilities are covered. Are specific vulnerabilities of marginalized groups, of indigenous peoples also considered? What about small-scale farmers? What about people using the coastlines like fisher folk? What is going to happen to them when coastlines are facing more and more competition? For instance, when new terminals or new electrolyzers are entering the coastlines. And the last point covers epistemic justice, wondering to what extent is knowledge transfer happening, who is able to benefit from the new energy knowledge, from the new hydrogen knowledge that has been produced. Is there a kind of equal share? Do we see a kind of transfer of patents or licenses happening, or is this all knowledge that is confined to the global north? So this means many of these issues need to be tackled, and so it's a very broad catalog that we have been formulating, because we want to create a multi-scalar sense of awareness. So this just in a nutshell, and maybe as a shameless self-promotion. There's much to read on that. We have published extensively. We have an article on hydrogen justice. We have just recently issued the first comparative study comparing the risks extractivist patterns in 28 prospective exporting countries, and we have done several work also on Namibia and South Africa and on energy colonialism, in case you want to read more and are curious for thought-provoking writings. So much for that.
Thank you so much. I would like to move back to Tony Boykes and to Hyphen, as already mentioned by Dr. Franziska Müller, where the research also takes place in Namibia. And I would be wondering, how does Hyphen envision its project to maybe contribute to the different dimensions just presented of hydrogen justice, particularly looking at the involvement, how are indigenous communities involved, knowing that Nama community publicly rejected the green hydrogen expansion, and also knowing that where the project is being located is next to Shark Island, as already mentioned by Franziska Müller, which is also has a sacred and historical meaning to the Nama and Ovaherero people. Shark Island is also known as the death camp. It's the most notorious concentration camp by the German colonial administration. And where Hyphen is located is also where the first genocide of the 20th century took place. And as Nama activist Sima Lupert says, at least for that, it needs to be protected. So how do you see the Hyphen project being involved in all of these different dimensions of struggle and resistance, and maybe also grievance and injustices that took place in the past? Also looking again, as mentioned by Franziska Müller, the human remains of people killed and the burial sites of former Shark Island inmates that might be located right at the around the seabed, around the island, and the several not yet marked mass graves, which are considered to be located directly where Hyphen is also setting its infrastructure up and the infrastructure path it will use.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was a mouthful. I have to say, though, that you've stated a number of things as a matter of fact, and they are not, because there's a lot of misinformation in what you have shared. First of all, the Hyphen Project, and I'll allow me an opportunity to share my screen in a moment. The Hyphen and the land, the concession area that was allocated to Hyphen, which is in the national park, the old Sperrgebied, the Zoutreek, is an area where there are no people living on. So there's nobody that is reliant on that area. The EIA process makes provision for, as any EIA process would do, looking at any cultural heritage or archaeological sites, and there's a process that is enshrined in our law of how one would deal with it if you came across in the development of the project to that. So that is clear. The Hyphen Project is not located on Shark Island. There are no parts of the project that are related to Shark Island. As a Namibian, and again, I think the issues that this particular webinar is aiming to highlight are really, really critical issues. Very, very critical issues. And with our own colonial history, it's very important to speak about these things. It's important to address the question of whether or not reparations will be paid by Germany to Namibia in a way that satisfies the Nama and Bahero traditional people. But it is not appropriate to use that narrative to undermine projects in a green hydrogen strategy and green industrialization strategy developed by the Namibian government. Otherwise, you inadvertently do the same thing that you are criticizing your respective governments for doing, which is interfering in a sovereign to determine what its development path should be. But to come back to the issue of Shark Island, this is an important one. So in terms of location, there will be, first of all, these project areas in the park, and that is not an area of a heritage site in dispute at all. Shark Island is adjacent to the existing port, which is Robert Harbour, very close to Lüderitz, or in Lüderitz. Just south of Robert Harbour is what we refer to as Angra Point. And Angra Point is where a new port will be established, and that is the port that will feed the developments of green hydrogen. That is nowhere near Shark Island. So to make the assertions in a webinar like this and state it as a matter of fact is harmful to the development of the sector in Namibia. When we talk about ESG and how people in Namibia would benefit, you know, Namibia looks to, we will be producing 2 million tons of green ammonia. That Southern Corridor Development Initiative has the capacity to produce about 18 million tons of green ammonia alone. That's one of 3 green hydrogen valleys in Namibia. Namibia has the potential to position itself as a key exporter of green ammonia and other green hydrogen derivatives to the world. And that's really, really important for Namibia. So we can make a contribution to helping the world decarbonize, a significant one at that. But what's more important for Namibia is economic development. We have the second most unequal country in the world after South Africa. We have a 38% youth unemployment rate. That is significant. We've included specific targets around employment for youth. So let me conclude my thought. Namibia has concluded an agreement with us when you look at the fiscal contributions, and that is through 24% equity in the dividends we'll throw from that. Land rentals. We are undertaking a feasibility and have to pay millions of euros in land rentals that escalate from 6 million euros per annum to 10 million to 12 million euros per annum. All of that, including environmental levies, taxes, etc. Namibia takes over 50% of all of the proceeds that will flow from the Hyphen Project. In addition to that, Namibia is looking, as the Hyphen Project alone, we will be producing over 7 gigawatts of wind and solar. That's about 10 times what Namibia is currently producing in terms of electricity. One of the 2 key benefits from water and electricity that we have included in our agreement is, we've said, we will produce excess power. Namibia is currently importing maybe about 300 megawatts of power from South Africa, dirty power. The excess power that Namibia alone can produce or can offer to the Namibian government has the potential to immediately decarbonize the Namibian grid, which is already at 70% decarbonized, relying on hydro. And it will ensure security of supply for Namibia, right? And on water, the same. We are oversizing our desalination facility in order to provide excess water to the town of Lidritz, because against the recognition that this is a water-scarce country. In addition to that, we can talk about how Namibia has developed a roadmap for green industrialization, not just in country, where it has said we will produce green hydrogen to produce synthetic fuels, to look at the hard to abate sectors like shipping and aviation. We will produce fertilizer in country. We will position Namibia as an ammonia bunkering area because of our strategic regional location, and so on and so on. In addition to that, it will is looking to supply South Africa through a green hydrogen pipeline, green hydrogen to help that country, which is one of the top 15 carbon emitters in the world, to help that country decarbonize by supplying its heavy fuel industry.
Thank you, Tony.
And so on and so on.
You also mentioned the aspect of inequality within the Namibian society, and also there's inequality now already in terms of access to land due to the colonial history and the post-colonial developments in the country. Now 70% of land is owned by white farmers, for instance, and white Namibians make only up less than 10% of the population. So my question would also be, how does Hyphen want to ensure the access to land and electricity and water supply to the Namibian communities and Namibians, as it is a project, as you outlined, from Namibia for Namibia, also having in mind the fishing industry which is located there, and knowing that hydrogen is a very land-intensive and water-intensive endeavor?
Yeah, the beauty of Namibia and why it has this competitive advantage is its access to large tracts of land. That land and the what we call the old Sperrgebiet, as you know, has been mining diamonds since its discovery in the 1900s by the Germans. And that area has been close to the world. Again, Namibia post-COVID said, we need to develop our country and we will use that land area in order to allocate, and I want to show you, maybe just take the opportunity to show you, I don't have sharing abilities. Let me know and then I can share the map. So Namibia has embarked on this journey. Hyphen is a green hydrogen developer. Our role and function is that we are the catalyst for the production of large-scale green hydrogen projects in Namibia. And you'll see that in many of our approaches, we, for instance, will be implementing a concept of common user infrastructure where we look to initially build all of the infrastructure for future developers to basically scale up the rapid deployment of green hydrogen.
You are now co-host, Tony Barkers, in case you still want to quickly share your map. If it's possible, maybe just like for 1 or 2 more minutes. And maybe you could also note again, because your project and your position is also to ensure the involvement of Namibians in the project. And I would like to ask, how accessible are the information on Hyphen so far for the people who are located near the project side, as it has been in news articles mentioned that public meetings took place in a region that was away from the people who were affected by it, and that there is no public discussion, and that most of the people also found out through social media on this of this project. So the question is also how, maybe you can see it there, how are you, like which kind of community engagement already take place, and what is planned in the future?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. What you'll see here is 3 slides that attempts to summarize our community engagement initiatives so far. When we signed the agreement 2 years ago with the government, the key component of that was obviously the socio-economic development framework. We proceeded, and these are pictures of when we publicly launched, and you'll see the regional leadership of Hartap and Paras, including the 2 governors and traditional leaders, at that launch of this framework. We then proceeded to translate that framework into 8 of indigenous languages in Namibia. And we embarked on what we call the National Roadshow. Namibia has 14 regions. We're a very large country, about 850,000 square kilometers in size. We have 14 regions. And we decided, together with government, which is represented by the Green Hydrogen chairperson, Obed Kanjobe, this is him there, and there, to go out and explain to Namibians, number 1, what is green hydrogen? Number 2, what is this green hydrogen strategy that the government have developed? And how does Hyphen fit into the strategy? But importantly, how do Namibians stand to benefit from this strategy through and the socio-economic development framework that Hyphen has negotiated? We have covered so far 9 of the 14 regions, and that has resulted in about 25 town hall style meetings where we're meeting with different stakeholders in the same room. You talked about the Nama people denying the project. That is simply not factual. Here is a picture of us engaging with the Nama traditional leadership in Keetmanshoop. Here we're engaging with the media to explain to them what the project is all about. Here we are with the town council in Ludritz. This is the Bastra traditional, this is the community that I come from, traditional leadership, and so on and so on. So we have, in the last 2 years, undertaken significant engagements all around the country, and we continue to do so. Our next phase in terms of this process, and I talked about IFC performance, about environmental, the same IFC performance standards apply when we talk about the social components. One of that is looking at implementing a stakeholder engagement strategy that starts with mapping who our stakeholders are. Who are they? What is the interest? Do we need to engage with those stakeholders in order to just inform them? Do we need to consult with them certain components of the project, or do we need to co-create some of the solutions that we need to find in order to implement a socio-economic development framework that will be impactful? That's the exercise that we're going through now. So the next 2.5 years will see the evolution of our early engagements now be more focused, where we will now only speak to the youth. We will now only speak to, and in addition to that, we have a local content roadshow that we are now embarking on. That local content roadshow only takes the component of localization and says, provides early information to local entities to say, these are the likely opportunities emerging from the Hyphen Project, and this is how you could potentially get involved. And we have identified 7 towns that we are doing that together with. There's the Namibia Investment and Promotion and Development Board that we have worked together on that, as well as
Tony.
the Namibia Chamber
if you
of Commerce
could
and Industry.
wrap up.
Yeah. To wrap up, here's a slide that shows the audience what are some of the key thinking about Namibians. Namibians are worried about, did you conclude a good agreement with government, or did government rather conclude a good agreement with us? Namibians are concerned, and when we embark on these processes, it's so important to have open and transparent conversations. So we want to have the difficult conversation. Was taxpayers' money used? Why only 24% equity and why not more? And we explain how these things work. But ultimately, Namibians are concerned, and when we talk about environmental impact, of course there will be an impact on the environment. The task for us is to find ways that we balance the absolute urgent need for economic development and the resources and the opportunities that the Namibian need, and we need to balance that with what are the most responsible ways that we can develop this project environmentally while meeting these much needed need for social and economic development in Namibia. That is the task.
Thank you. I think you made quite clear. Thank you for sharing what Hyphen has done so far, who they have been engaging with, and what is planned for the future. Emma Levy, I would also like to ask you, because the research from Dr. Franziska Müller is not only looking in the article on hydrogen justice, not only looking at the context of Namibia, but also Morocco. So how do you think the concept of hydrogen, as just explained by Dr. Franziska Müller, plays out in energy projects planned in West Sahara? Do you see any kind of justice elements being added or advanced through energy projects?
Yes, Emma's just fine. And yes, definitely. Sadly, I don't remember them all by heart now, but already the first one, like the procedural justice, the Sahrawi people are not part of any discussion. They completely ignored the intent of doing so, and I think it's also those usually that are least polluting, least contributing to the climate crisis are actually the ones most affected. Like I mentioned, there's little Sahrawi people still living in Western Sahara. Most of them live in a refugee camp, which is a few kilometers away in Algeria, which is in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And there have been research done with the Polisario in collaboration with people who have knowledge about environmental developments and everything. And they saw that they live in one of the most dangerous areas considered with a climate crisis, because not only is it the heat, which is extremely high. So right now in the summer it exceeds 50 degrees. My grandma lives there, my great aunt lives there, they're all above 70, 80, and at times say, I don't even know if I can breathe, like they are unable to breathe, and dependent on ventilators, which if energy are shut down, they have their issues then, and also heavy extreme rainfalls which are causing flooding. So just a few weeks ago, there was heavy flooding in the refugee camps of Dakhla, which are a bit further away from the other refugee camps, causing people to lose their livelihoods, their houses, basically being homeless. Thankfully, there's a good structure, and also the organizers asked me set up a fundraiser, so I can just advertise to join and help if you can. So they are most affected, they have also limited resources, and also because they are not considered in any climate talks, like the COPs and everything. They are not invited. And Morocco is getting all the lights for being this big pioneer in terms of renewable energy, and also getting credits for their projects, even though they're in the occupied territories. The UNFCCC is not calling them out for it, and they're taking up the space where the Sahrawi people cannot talk about their struggle, the ones most affected by the by the climate crisis, and then also they have done their own reports. So there's the NDC reports, there's reports on how you're gonna reduce emissions, which is done by every country. They've also produced their own report, but it's disregarded, even though they have the traditional knowledge of how to deal with the issues there. I mean, they are, as I said, not causing the issues of climate crisis, but have set up how after independence they will be tackling issues of flooding, of heat, etc. So I think I just want to emphasize what we want is that any company, any state, to withdraw from Western Sahara, to not do any projects there, unless they have serious talks with the Polisario, which is the only legal representative, or after referendum has taken place. But as long as none of these two conditions are fulfilled, there should be no projects there, because they're just cementing greenwashing and occupation, and the ones bearing the costs are the Sahrawi people in the refugee camps, are the ones in the occupied territories who are faced with repressive measures, kidnapping, rape, sexual violence, killings. Just recently a boy was shot by Moroccan authorities, so this is very serious. And we need change, and that means no renewable projects or any resource extraction in Western Sahara.
Thank you so much, Emma. I would like to wrap up our discussion now to still give our viewers the opportunity to ask some questions, and I would just make a short resume about what we just talked about. We started with the basics about what hydrogen is, how it is produced, what are the different ways of production or the different colors of hydrogen, and also the environmental risks involved. We then moved on to the impacts of hydrogen. How does hydrogen production and also green hydrogen production especially has an impact on development, on social development maybe also, and on the environment as well, and on freedom or injustice reoccurring. We then discussed the concept hydrogen justice, as Dr. Franziska Müller represented, and also tied back the global hydrogen expansion to energy colonialism in the context of Morocco, of West Sahara, of Namibia, and also in relation to the involvement of Germany and German companies in that sense. And I would just like to give the panelists maybe the chance in like 1 or 2 sentences to share what they want to share, and then I will open up the floor for the questions. I have some of the questions that were posed with me, so I'm going to select a few. I would just like to end my moderation here with the open question that could also be picked up by the panelists. As we have seen, the hydrogen industry is very much shaped by which relations have been happening in the past. It's very context specific. In the case of Morocco and Western Sahara, we see a relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. In the case of Namibia, we have the German government somehow involved, the European Union involved, and we have a German company involved. And with that in mind, I would just like to put out the question if you think that energy projects could have been implemented, especially hydrogen project with the excessive amount of water and land that needs to be used, if there hasn't been colonialism, if there hasn't been the apartheid regime, if there hasn't been also a genocide in Namibia. And I would like to give the speakers or the panelists the opportunity to give a last sentence to the audience and then pick up the questions. Tony Barkes, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, and I'm going to try and be brief. I want to say the first reason why Namibia is even considering this is not because of its colonial history or apartheid history and the influence of its former colonial masters, but because it has a natural competitive advantage to deliver green hydrogen at low cost to the globe. We have co-located wind and solar resources with a negative correlation, access to the ocean that provides the water that we need, and export opportunity to global markets. That's why we are doing this. And we are helping the world decarbonize, but at the same time build our own economies. That's really, really, really important. And another point to note is this is very, very different from the historical extractive industry that we've seen. Typically, you would need to take the gold or the diamonds out of the ground, and historically it's been shipped to the global north where it's been processed, and the people in country have derived the smallest benefit. And I am as upset about that history as you are, because I'm an African and a Namibian. The reality here is, and why green hydrogen is different, we cannot export the wind, nor can we export the sun. In order to develop green ammonia, you have to bring the investment to the global south, and that's the beauty. You have to utilize the skills in country to produce the product, and then you export that.
Thank you.
The further thing, it is sustainable in nature, right? So it doesn't run out. So very, very different from the extractive industry, and it's important that the audience understands that.
Thank you. I would then give the opportunity to Dr. Franziska Müller for her last words.
Yeah, thank you. I'll maybe try to go to a more global level. I think it's very clear, and we have heard that this evening, that of course within the green capitalist frame that we are currently experiencing, the model Namibia is working, and it's a kind of first mover model, that's clear. But then also, I mean, there are several elephants in the room that we haven't been talking about so much. One of these is, to what extent is the green capitalist model actually feasible? To what extent can we really build on that massive expansion of low carbon energy? Do we have the resources for that? And I mean, it's of course very clear that it's not the same resource extractivist model that we have been seeing before, but still it's an externalization of carbon responsibility to the global south again. Germany itself is not doing the job that it should do in terms of like deindustrialization, in terms of being aware of their own historical responsibility. This is only happening by using territories in the global south once again. And of course, there might be a win-win option, but still, it's quite clear that the green capitalist model can't run on the same condition as before. And it has been very clear that we also need to talk about degrowth. We can't go on with the same mode of industrial production and annual economic growth than we have had before. And this is a question that also targets the whole hydrogen industry. We can't just say, okay, let's decarbonize our steel sectors and go on with the same model as before. We have to cut down this in a very, very rapid way. Otherwise, future generations will still be harmed. So this may be a point I'm putting in for now, because that's another dimension that we see coming in, and maybe a point where we, even though we might have different positions, might very much agree on. Thanks.
Thank you. Emma Levy for the last words.
Yes, I do want to emphasize that we are facing a climate crisis and we need action very fast, very radically. But they all have to be based on international and human rights law. And that's, I think, very simple to do. So no renewable projects in Western Sahara as long as they're violating and cementing occupation and violating the right to self-determination of the Sahrawi people. And once there has been the respect, and I mean, where the Sahrawi people are open to talks, we can start projects fighting climate crisis and ending our dependency on fossil fuels for energy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will open now the question section, and I have several questions here with me. The first one I would like to read out is the following. Hyphen signed an MOU with Namport. Tony Burkes, you already mentioned Namport briefly. What is the exact content? So I would direct this question to you.
I'm not entirely sure. There's no... Hyphen has been involved with NAM Port and the Port of Rotterdam to develop a port master plan for the new developments of Angra Point, which is the port that I mentioned earlier, that will primarily be used for the delivery, the export of green hydrogen and green hydrogen derivatives. And of course, ports are strategic assets of strategic interest for countries. Hyphen is only part of that MOU and that thinking because of it being the first customer potentially.
Thank you. The next question is a bit more related to human rights, so I might direct it to Franziska Müller. Dr. Franziska Müller, how can we better integrate and guarantee human rights and green hydrogen production, like in practice and concretely? Maybe that's also a question for you, Emily.
Yeah, at the moment we have several indicator systems coming up, and this is a kind of development that I have been, expecting since like 2 years' time when we wrote that article. And most of the indicator systems are very much focusing, of course, on environmental issues, questions of water and land use, and also questions of participation. And this all makes, of course, perfect sense. But still, I mean, in many of these participation procedures, often the right to say no, the free, prior, informed consent is somehow rigged. So this is a question in terms of human rights that we have to keep in mind, of course. Also, we have to keep in mind the kind of recognition of justice, so to take extra care of any vulnerable group affected by hydrogen production. And for me, it's also very important to be aware of the long historical dimensions. I think I have already pointed that out before, and often I see the historical dimension or also the epistemic dimension not so much covered in the current indicator schemes. And another point is we've been talking very much about things that are happening on the ground where the human eye can see. We talked very much about the land use, and a bit about the coastlines, but we don't talk so much about what is happening in the sea, under the seawater. We didn't talk about desalination issues, and this is a major point because very often people still think of the ocean as that large place where stuff can be dumped. And at the moment, we don't have strict desalination standards so far, like in the around the Middle East coastline. Lots of brine happening, being caused by desalination, is just dumped into the sea. This may be a major problem both for the coastal ecosystems and also when climate change is kicking in even more, because this might also heat up the ocean a bit. There is lots of research on that already happening, and I would find it really important to have very strict desalination standards also for the Hyphen Project. But at a previous talk I had with Hyphen people, the idea was just, well, let's have longer pipelines, but this of course isn't causing the issue. So when we are now talking about ESG standards, I would be really, really happy to see that there is a strict and clear-cut regulation on the desalination issue and what's happening to the brine. So please also think about the ocean. That's maybe as a final and a bit nerdy point, but I want to see the fish flourishing and be happy.
Thank you. I would now direct the same question to Emma regarding human rights in the green hydrogen production, or also if you would like to expand it a bit more, human rights in the renewable energy sector in the context of Western Sahara.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, the most fundamental right which is violated is the right to self-determination. I think that's most fundamental for us, and that already has to stop kind of the projects from happening. I think what we should also talk about is the blatant ignorance of companies in Western Sahara towards human rights violation happening in Western Sahara. So firstly, the discrimination that they cannot participate in the job market, but also the repressive methods used. For example, there was one company, I cannot recall the name yet, but they're building solar parks in Western Sahara. And they did an open call with this kind of community involvement. And two Sahrawis wanted to join, and they were not allowed to, and they, I think, even last minute changed the location. So they were not even being indigenous to the land, able to participate. So it was not even being able, but they made sure that they would not be able to make it. And also, I mean, one of the biggest wind parks of Siemens is in Bujdur, and it's also the same city of one of the biggest human rights activists we have, Sultana Khaya, who has experienced a lot of violations of her rights and repressions over the years. She also, trigger warning, what I'm talking about now, 10 years ago during a demonstration lost one eye because it was hit so hard on her head. And then recently, the last 2 years, she has been protesting from her house, around her neighborhood, and has been raped. Her mother, who was very old, I think around 80, her sister, they were in house arrest for 1 whole year. It was all in the media coverage. It's and it was easily accessible to see all the harm that has been done by Moroccan authorities on Sultana Khaya and other human rights activists that are all around these wind parks. And I think we should also assume responsibilities, or call companies responsible not only for human rights violations happening within their companies, but also in those areas, because they are enabling and basically funding in a way, because of all the profits Morocco is making with them, the repressive methods. So it's the violation of the self-determination, and also accepting and supporting, basically being somewhat complicit in enabling these human rights violations from happening.
Thank you so much, Anna Levy. Thank you, Tony Boykes. Thank you, Dr. Franziska Müller, for joining us today for our discussion on hydrogen from overseas, energy systems and neo-colonial power dynamics. We now spent around 90 minutes together discussing the case of Namibia, the expansion of the hydrogen sector, specifically green hydrogen, the involvement of German companies in West Sahara, as well as the Namibian Hyphen Project. Again, I would also like to thank the viewers who stayed with us for so long and to also send us questions. As mentioned in the beginning, this event is funded by Engagement Global and in support from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And the event series from ASW doesn't stop today, but it's continuing in the next month. On the 4th of November, there's gonna be another event. You can look for the details on the website of ASW. And there's going to be a full day program with different discussions with climate justice activists from the so-called Global South. And yeah, we are looking very much forward to that as well. And we're hoping to see some of you there too. And for now, I wish you all a good evening wherever you are located. And yeah, let's hope for a change in terms of the current structures we are seeing in the industrial energy projects that move more towards supporting self-determination, to supporting freedom, and to supporting justice in the different contexts they are located. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Keep on with the good stuff.